my name is Tharsis. I work at Smart Freight Center, and I oversee the technical outputs from the Fleet Electrification Coalition. We're a rather small and young group that has a mission within Smart Freight Center to increase the adoption of road freight electrification globally. So I think most of our work at this point has been in Europe and the US, but we support also our colleagues in China and in India, as well as currently or soon increasing our support in East Africa. And so let's dive in. Can we go to the next slide? So one of the questions we often get from the companies that work with us is the question of the business case. Like, what exactly is the business case for road freight electrification? We understand that there is a business case, and currently it's becoming a bit more tangible than it used to be, whether it's from increase in income or green premiums or whatever you would term it, or compliance, or in increasing sort of the credit scores for financing. In all of these cases, it's becoming increasingly important to be more specific and more accurate on what kind of impact any of the electric truck implementation or adoptions projects will create. And that is usually in the form of emissions reductions. But what we need there is, of course, we need people to understand how to calculate that emissions reductions, how to calculate the emissions of the new transport services. But unfortunately, as you can see, the stats show that only about 60% are able to calculate its transport-related greenhouse gas emissions currently, or at least as of 2023, when this survey was conducted. And out of that, only about 69% of shippers and 41% of carriers consistently use an established standard. So you can imagine that if you're creating a business case, but you keep on using different methodologies, different standards, there's kind of like this vagueness or uncertainty in the calculations that you've done, which puts a lot of your own calculations or your business case into question. Next. So in the next 10 minutes, I'd like to introduce the ISO 14083, which is the current greenhouse gas emission reporting standard for transport and logistics chains, and focus really on what's happening, what might be different in electric transport services. And then I'll end with a research project and research direction, actually, that is aiming to improve the consistency of the electricity emission factor databases that have been developed in the past and improve it for the future. And this also relates to how this methodology can be applied worldwide, and not just simply in one location, not just in Europe, not just in the US, but hopefully globally everyone is using the same way of understanding and calculating these emission factors. Okay, next. So the history of the ISO 14083 actually starts with the GLEC framework, which was in the past the industry standard for calculating multimodal logistics supply chain emissions. And it was recognized by Greenhouse Gas Protocol and a couple of these other standards or NGOs that you see on the slide, and used worldwide and used by quite a number of multinationals. And it's also spurred the development of tools and programs based on that standard. But that was not enough. We had an industry standard, but we also want to take it global and really increase its, the credibility and the standing of the standard. And so work was being done even quite really at the beginning of since the GLEC framework was launched, to include or create an ISO standard based on the GLEC. And so in 2023, the ISO 14083 finally, after a couple of years, was published. And it was based on the GLEC framework, but also included a slightly broader scope, which is the inclusion of passenger transport. Our focus at Smart Freight Center is, of course, only on freight transport emissions, but we supported, the GLEC framework could have been expanded to also passenger transport. And now we work at Smart Freight Center to update the GLEC framework. The GLEC framework is now not a standard anymore in a way, but a guideline for how to apply the ISO 14083. And it's sort of maybe the industry way of interpreting the standard so that it's more tangible, more usable, more user-friendly, hopefully. And by the way, that can be downloaded free of charge on our website. Now, we have a little poll, Angelo. So this is a Slido. So if you can just scan this very quickly, I think the one thing I'd like to just sort of gauge moving forward, just also trying to make sure that I am speaking to the audience, towards the audience, is so just understand how familiar you are with the GLEC framework or the ISO 14083, whether is it sort of just theoretical, or do you really use it? Have you applied it yourself? Or have you never heard of it before? All of this is important. Now, it's, of course, more applicable if you are a logistics service provider or a tool provider, but it looks like at least it's familiar to some, and that's great. All right. Okay. So I'm happy to take questions in the chat. Maybe I'll try to answer some of them after I give the presentation. But feel free to type in your questions, and I will address them when I have the time. And if not, then feel free to also reach out to us, because we have a bunch of resources and training that can help you with with you getting familiar and being sort of more a master of the GLEC framework. Okay, next. All right, so some principles of the methodology. And this is really just to get really a high level, especially for those who are not familiar with the GLEC framework or the ISO 14083, both are kind of similar. The methodology is for multimodal transport chains. So it's not just for road freight, it also includes maritime, aviation, and the hubs, especially where transshipment or transportation hubs are involved. It's compatible with the greenhouse gas protocol scopes. Of course, they are a different type of standard, but they are very much compatible. So if you calculate according to ISO, you can very easily fill in your sustainability reporting according to the scopes. It covers all the IPCC greenhouse gases, and we typically think of it finally in terms of a CO2 equivalent. Angela? It takes into account the full energy life cycle, so well to wheel, which is very relevant for when we're thinking about electric vehicle operations, right, which doesn't have any fuel combustion. It doesn't have any tank to wheel operational emissions. We need to take into account what happens before. How was the electricity actually produced? So it takes into account the entire life cycle. It's an activity-based calculation. So we moved away, I think, a decade ago from spend-based emission calculation to actually calculations based on the quantity of freight multiplied by the transport activity distance. And this helps us to understand, Angelo, the impact of load factor and empty running. So it's not just about improvement of the powertrain or changing the fuel, but also if you are using your vehicles better, logistics efficiency, vehicle efficiency, that will be reflected in the calculations. And finally, the primary outputs are both the absolute emissions and the emission intensity. So emission intensity is basically the emissions associated with the transport activity. And in this case, I put here the unit as ton kilometer, but which is the default, which we mostly use. But in some cases, other units can also be used. Okay, now with that, hopefully that's really clear. Let's make this a bit more tangible. The calculation of emissions depends on the on your access to data. How you actually approach it depends on access to data. Ideally, we have an accurate quantity of energy or fuel, electricity, or diesel, biofuels, whatever it is, the amount of energy used, and you multiply that by the energy emission factor. And the energy emission factor by the necessity is an average of the life cycle emissions produced from that fuel. So if you multiply those, you get a CO2 value. We don't always have access to the energy because some of us are shippers. We don't have access to understanding how much fuel is actually consumed. So in that case, we can calculate it based on transport activity. And that's just multiplying that by an emission intensity value, which I introduced earlier. That's why it's important to have that calculation done, which should be able to be obtained from the carriers or the fleet operators that are actually carrying out the transport, or the use of default factors in the worst case scenario. The fleet operators calculate the emission intensity value based on a CO2 equivalent value. Angelo? And so that really so we can use primary data technically to calculate all the emissions along the value chain. And we should do that so that we are more accurate. So typically these are two ways you can calculate your emissions. And the first way is typically done by those who are calculating scope 1, scope 2, as in you own the assets, and therefore you should theoretically know how much fuel or energy you have used. Or in scope 3, you don't own the assets, you buy a transport service, you should be able to get that information that's necessary from the transport service provider. And you should have transport activity data yourself. Now, there are a lot of nuances here, and I wouldn't want to go into that too much today. But again, reach out to us or ask us later on. All right, next. So how does it look like for an EV-based operation? Now, just make a small aside. Some of you might be familiar with what the TOC is. It's called it stands for Transport Operation Category. And basically, like a very quick definition is that we use a TOC type calculation in the ISO to represent a fleet or an operation type. It's sort of you aggregate or you average the emissions or the energy across a fleet of vehicles, not just a single vehicle. This has to do with reducing errors, but also to take into account the fact that some vehicles are just simply more efficient than others, even if it's just diesel, or the routes are more efficient than others. But we want to make sure that when we communicate the performance of a fleet, it's done at an average level. So that's just a very quick way to get into understanding this acronym. Right. So the calculation is, can we go back just very quickly to the previous slide? Yeah, the calculation is very simple, right? It's multiplying the transport operation category level vehicle energy intensity factor, which is given in kilowatts per ton kilometers, by the energy provision emission factor, which is given in grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hours. And this is specifically for EVs because there isn't an operational emission factor because there's no tailpipe emissions. If it was a diesel or a internal combustion engine, then you'll have the sort of like the well-to-wheel emission factor. But in this case, we don't need to care so much about that. We just need to care about how the energy was actually provided. And that includes production of the electricity and the charging. All right, if you multiply that, then we get a value and emission intensity that represents that particular emissions, that particular operations or that fleet that is serving maybe your clients, or it represents the transport activity that you're carrying out. Okay, next. So how much energy is required by the fleet to carry out 1 ton-kilometer worth of transport activity? That's the question that you're trying to answer if you're calculating the TOC level, vehicle energy intensity factor. So there is, this is sort of a sketch of how energy is delivered from where it's produced towards where it's being used, right? So you have, if you, in some cases, you have on-site power generation, solar panels or wind, you have your own electricity, or you have grid electricity, and that's coming, well, I didn't put a power plant icon here, but you can, it looks like a coal power plant or gas power plant, whatever it is. And you're getting it from the grid. And then it's going to the meter of the facility. So that's usually the interface between the facility, which is owned by the charging station or the depot or the warehouse, wherever it is, the interface between them and the electricity providers or the distribution network. From the meter, it goes to a variety of different equipment, including the charging station or the charging equipment. And from there, it goes to the battery of the electric truck. So calculating the energy that is required depends, and we're trying to understand the energy that's required at the vehicle level. We need to take into account the losses from whichever data point we're using. For example, if we're using the metered energy consumption data or charging activity data, we just need to account for the losses all the way to the vehicle. So Angelo, next. So yeah, I mean, there are efficiencies that we need to account for. Now, the metered energy consumption data represents the total. Can we just go back very quickly to the previous slide? Sorry. The meter energy consumption data represents the total electricity consumed at the charging facilities. But what finally is delivered to the battery could be much less. So in this case, I just put some random numbers here. In one charging session, what is calculated or measured at the vehicle could be an increase of 400 or 400 kilowatt hours charged. But what was actually inputted or extracted from the grid could have been 420 kilowatt hours or more or less. So in this case, there is a bit of a loss. Now, if you own this facility, you would definitely understand or know how much is lost simply because you pay for it. That's your bill comes from 420, not from 400. But if you are just a recipient of a charging service, you might not have that data. So just a point here to be clear about what kind of data you're using in order to calculate the energy intensity factor of the vehicle. Okay, then we can go next. Right, so since we know that energy is lost along the way, we also need to make sure that the emission factors that we're using are updated according to the energy loss. So typically, grid electricity emission factors are factors that are based on the amount of energy consumed at the meter. So it doesn't take into account whatever happens after the meter, right? Could be charging stations, or it could be some other machine, or your laptop, or whatever it is. That doesn't matter. So we do need to make sure that the emission factor that we're using for charging our vehicles takes into account the losses there. And it's just a simple, subtraction or multiplication. In some cases, the losses at charging or the charging session itself could be up to 95%, 97%. Sorry, the efficiencies could be up to 95%, 97%. A conservative value, which I've heard, is 90%, so about losses for about 10%. So just taking that into account, you'll be able to aggregate and calculate a charging station emission factor. Other things that we need to take into account in calculating emission factor for the transport operating category is where the charging station is located. The grid electricity emission factor typically depends on which country you're located, or in the US, which subgrid that that the charging is or electricity is being used. Besides that, you should also need to take into account, like what I mentioned, the amount of energy that you generate yourself on site, or the battery energy storage systems that you have on site. So just taking that into account, you'll be able to calculate a fairly accurate charging station emission factor. And this is important because for a fleet, if you're thinking about an operation, if you're not just thinking about one vehicle, if you're thinking about a couple of vehicles, and let's say they're running all across Europe, each different country will have its own energy emission factor. So what you do need to do is aggregate all of that based on the charging demand in the different countries at the different charging stations. And having that will give you like the most accurate average emission factor that you need. Okay, so moving on. So the single electricity emission factor. Sorry, moving on, Angelo. Are composed of different categories, and this was already determined in the greenhouse gas protocol and in the ISO. And there are differences between greenhouse gas protocol, the way they look at emission factors, and what ISO 14083, possibly because the ISO 14083 is rather new, just 2 years ago, it was finalized. Yeah, so different categories. So you can differentiate at what's happening at the power plant, all the emissions associated with producing the electricity itself, right? So there's fuel combustion, obviously, produces emissions, but there's also upstream emissions. So what is required to produce and distribute the fuel that goes into the power plant. And then in some cases, it might be very relevant to calculate the power generation infrastructure. And this is something new, I think, that the greenhouse gas protocol didn't include. But it makes a lot of sense when we're moving towards sort of low carbon or renewable electricity or nuclear power plants. There is still emissions associated with commissioning, constructing the infrastructure, the power plants or the solar panels or wind turbines, as well as decommissioning it. Now, it could be very small, and I'll show you a slide later, but it's still there. And so if we want to be precise, we should at least think about it. And then there is, once that electricity is generated, how that is moved towards finally the charging station and the vehicle itself. In the ISO and in the greenhouse gas protocol as well, they take into account the consumption mix of the grid, so not a power generation mix. And that takes into account the effects of electricity trade, for example. So some countries which they may produce a lot of electricity based on coal or gas, but they import a lot of renewables from somewhere else, will have an overall lower emission factor. There are also grid average losses from transmission distribution, and so on average about 3 to 4%. And then, of course, the electrical and charging infrastructure losses, which I mentioned earlier, 3 to 10% losses. So all of this adds up, and it's just important to remember and apply and get the data that you need to fill up your calculations. Okay, next.
Just to quickly mention, Tharsis, that we are quite late. So we are like over 10 minutes. So I don't know if we can to give the time to other speakers as
well. Let me run through this. This is just you get the slides. So this just shows you the magnitude of emissions, life cycle emissions from power plants that rely on fuels, fossil fuels, and power plants that rely on renewables or nuclear. And we can go next. Let me introduce this. So one of the complaints that we often get is, yeah, our ISO introduced all of these very nice, fancy electricity emission factor categories, but where can we get the emission factors from? So there is a research Horizon Europe research project called Clever, and they are currently in the process of understanding the emission factors, what are the methodologies behind the different databases, and work towards harmonizing it. So we will see hopefully some good news about how they can do a very smart way of harmonizing the methodologies used across the different countries and different suppliers. And what you can see here is the different categories. Some are fulfilled by some of the databases and some are not. And we will see finally what is the outcome of this in probably about 1.5 years. Okay, then next. And this is my last slide. So I would be interested to, so we have a couple of resources, and we're thinking of developing a course to help you to calculate emissions from your e-truck operations. And if you would like to register your interest, please scan. I'll also put in the link in the chat later. And it covers a couple of basics. It's sort of an add-on from GLEC, but takes what is GLEC or the ISO into what we need for electric freight operations. And with that, I will end. Thank you for your patience. Sorry, Angelo, for going over time.